Joseph is an important person in the Hebrew Bible. His life connects the narrative of Abraham, Isaac and Jacob in Canaan to the subsequent narrative of the liberation of the Israelites from slavery in Egypt. The book of Genesis tells that Joseph was the 11th of Jacob's 12 sons and Rachel's firstborn, and tells how Joseph came to be sold into slavery by his jealous brothers, and rose to become vizier, the second most powerful man in Egypt next to Pharaoh. When famine struck Canaan, Jacob and Joseph's brothers came to the land of Goshen in Egypt. According to the Book of Jubilees, Joseph was born on 1 Tammuz. Origins. Etymology. The Bible offers two explanations of the name Yosef. First, it is compared to the word asaph from the root sp, taken away. And she conceived, and bore a son, and said, God hath taken away my reproach. Joseph is then identified with the similar root ysp, meaning, add. And she called his name Joseph, and said, the Lord shall add to me another son. Text analysis. 19th century source criticism divided the Joseph story between the Jahwist, Elahist and priestly sources of the documentary hypothesis. In the early 20th century, Hermann Gunkel suggested that, unlike the Abraham-Isaac-Jacob stories, the Joseph story formed a single unitary story with literary rather than oral origins. In 1953, Gerhard von Rad made a detailed assessment of its literary artistry and drew attention to its identity as a wisdom novella, and in 1968 R.N. Y. Bray argued that unity in artistry implied a single author. All three insights are now widely accepted, and the majority of modern biblical scholars date the Joseph story in its current form to the 5th century BCE Persian era at the earliest. There have been many attempts to trace the story's redaction history, including work by Donald Redford. His theory states that a first Reuben version of the story originated in the northern kingdom of Israel and was intended to justify the domination by the house of Joseph over the other tribes. This was followed by a later Judah expansion, elevating Judah as the rightful successor to Jacob. And finally various embellishments were added so that the novella would function as the bridge between the Abraham-Isaac-Jacob material in Genesis and the following story of Moses and the Exodus. Historicity. Some scholars, such as Israel Finkelstein and Israel Noel, claim Joseph to be a summarizing character of the Hyksos period, created as a reference of the glorious past of Hyksos, which was still preserved by their descendants by the time of the Israelites' emergence during the Iron Age in Canaan. From these scholars' point of view, the Hyksos descendants were part of the Proto-Israelite groups which joined to form the biblical Israelite nation. The Hyksos began settling in Egypt around 1800 BCE after earlier contacts, grew in power, and were later expelled by Ahmose I around 1550 BCE. Many modern-day scholars believe the historicity of the events in the Joseph narrative cannot be demonstrated. Others compare the burial of his bones at Shechem with the disposal of Dionysus's bones at Delphi. For Schenker, the tradition of Joseph's burial at Shechem is understood as a secondary, Israelitic historical interpretation woven around a more ancient Canaanite shrine in that area. The reworked legends and folklore were probably inserted into the developing textual tradition of the Bible between the 8th and 6th centuries BCE. Most scholars place its composition in a genre that flourished in the Persian period of the exile. James Hoffmeyer has argued that evidence may yet be found to back the Hebrew Bible's story of Joseph's life in ancient Egypt. David Rohl has also defended the biblical story of Joseph as historical based on archaeological findings. Better source needed. The famine stela of Egypt is one such archaeological finding, but the scholarly consensus is against the idea that it documents the same famine that appears in the biblical narrative. Another theory suggests that Joseph is the historical character Amenhotep I, vizier of Pharaoh Amenhotep III. father of the monotheistic pharaoh Akhenaten. According to his book, the association between Joseph and Amenhotep I can be demonstrated according to a nominative inscription found in the tomb of Amenhotep I, which would be found copied word for word, mistakes included, in the Bible chapter, Genesis chapter 41, 40-46. Biblical narrative. Family. Joseph, son of Jacob and Rachel, lived in the land of Canaan with 10 half-brothers, 1 full brother, and at least 1 half-sister. He was Rachel's firstborn and Jacob's 11th son. Of all the sons, Joseph was preferred by his father, and this is represented by a long coat of many colors. When Joseph was 17 years old, he had 2 dreams that made his brothers plot his demise. In the first dream, Joseph and his brothers gathered bundles of grain, of which those his brothers gathered bowed to his own. In the second dream, the sun, the moon, and 11 stars bowed to Joseph himself. These dreams, implying his supremacy, angered his brothers. Plot against Joseph. Joseph's half-brothers were jealous of him, wherefore, in Dothan, most of them plotted to kill him, with the exception of Reuben, who suggested to have Joseph thrown into an empty cistern, intending to rescue Joseph himself. Unaware of this secondary intention, the others obeyed his first. Upon imprisoning Joseph, the brothers saw a camel caravan carrying spices and perfumes to Egypt, and sold Joseph to these merchants. Thereafter the guilty brothers painted goat's blood on Joseph's coat and showed it to Jacob, who therefore believed Joseph dead. Potiphar's house. Ultimately, Joseph was sold to Potiphar, the captain of Pharaoh's guard. Later, Joseph became Potiphar's personal servant, and subsequently his household superintendent. Here, Potiphar's wife tried to seduce Joseph, which he refused. Angered by his running away from her, she made a false claim that he tried to rape her, and thus assured his imprisonment. Joseph in prison. The warden put Joseph in charge of the other prisoners, and soon afterward Pharaoh's chief cupbearer and chief baker, who had offended the Pharaoh, were thrown into the prison, and suffered dreams interpreted by Joseph, who stated that the chief cupbearer would be reinstated but the chief baker would be hanged. Joseph requested the cupbearer to mention him to Pharaoh and secure his release from prison, but the cupbearer, reinstalled in office, forgot Joseph. After 2 more years, the Pharaoh dreamt of 7 lean cows which devoured 7 fat cows, and of 7 withered ears of grain which devoured 7 fat ears. When the Pharaoh's advisors failed to interpret these dreams, the cupbearer arranged the summons of Joseph, who predicted 7 years of abundance followed by 7 years of famine, and advised the Pharaoh to store surplus grain. Vizier of Egypt. Following the prediction, Joseph became vizier, under the name of Zaphnath-Paneah, and was given Asenath, the daughter of Potiphar, priest of On, to be his wife. During the 7 years of abundance, Joseph ensured that the storehouses were full and that all produce was weighed. In the 6th year, Asenath bore 2 children to Joseph, Manasseh and Ephraim. When the famine came, it was so severe that people from surrounding nations came to Egypt to buy bread. The narrative also indicates that they went straight to Joseph or were directed to him, even by the Pharaoh himself. As a last resort, all of the inhabitants of Egypt, less the Egyptian priestly class, sold the properties to Joseph for seed, wherefore Joseph set a mandate that, because the people would be sowing and harvesting seed on government property, 1/5 of the produce should go to the Pharaoh. This mandate lasted until the days of Moses. Brothers sent to Egypt. In the 2nd year of famine, Joseph's half-brothers were sent to Egypt to buy goods. When they came to Egypt, they stood before the vizier but did not recognize him as their brother Joseph, who was now in his late 30s, but Joseph did recognize them and did not speak at all to them in his native tongue of Hebrew. After questioning them, he accused them of being spies. After they mentioned a younger brother at home, the vizier demanded that he be brought to Egypt as a demonstration of their veracity. This was Joseph's full brother, Benjamin. Joseph placed his brothers in prison for 3 days. On the third day, he brought them out of prison to reiterate that he wanted their youngest brother brought to Egypt to demonstrate their veracity. The brothers conferred amongst themselves, speaking in Hebrew, reflecting on the wrong they had done to Joseph. Joseph understood what they were saying and removed himself from their presence because he was caught in emotion. When he returned, the vizier took Simeon and bound him as a hostage. Then he had their donkeys prepared with grain and sent the other brothers back to Canaan. Unbeknownst to them, Joseph had also returned their money to their money sacks. The silver cup. The remaining brothers returned to their father in Canaan, and told him all that had transpired in Egypt. They also discovered that all of their money sacks still had money in them, and they were dismayed. Then they informed their father that the vizier demanded that Benjamin be brought before him to demonstrate that they were honest men. Jacob became greatly distressed, feeling that they treated him badly. After they had consumed all of the grain that they brought back from Egypt, Israel told his sons to go back to Egypt for more grain. With Reuben and Judah's persistence, they persuaded their father to let Benjamin join him for fear of Egyptian retribution. Upon their return to Egypt, the brothers were received by the steward of the house of Joseph. When they were brought to Joseph's house, they were apprehensive about the returned money in their money sacks. They thought that the mistransaction would somehow be used against them as a way to induct them as slaves and confiscate their possessions. So they immediately informed the steward of what had transpired to get a feel of the situation. The steward put them at ease, telling them not to worry about the money, and brought out their brother Simeon. Then he brought the brothers into the house of Joseph and received them hospitably. When the vizier appeared, they gave him gifts from their father. Joseph saw and inquired of Benjamin and was overcome by emotion but did not show it. He withdrew to his chambers and wept. When he regained control of himself, he returned and ordered a meal to be served. The Egyptians would not dine with Hebrews at the same table, as doing so was considered loathsome. So the sons of Israel were served at a separate table. That night, Joseph ordered his steward to load the brothers' donkeys with food and all their money. The money they brought was double what they had from the first trip. Deceptively, Joseph also ordered that his silver cup be put in Benjamin's sack. The following morning the brothers began their journey back to Canaan. Joseph ordered the steward to go after the brothers and question him about the missing silver cup. When the steward caught up with the brothers, he seized them and searched their sacks. The steward found the cup in Benjamin's sack just as he had planted it the night before. This caused a stir amongst the brothers. However, they agreed to be escorted back to Egypt. When the vizier confronted them about the silver cup, he demanded that the one who possessed the cup in his bag become his slave. In response, Judah pleaded with the vizier that Benjamin be allowed to return to his father, and he himself be kept in Benjamin's place as a slave. Family reunited, Judah appealed to the vizier begging that Benjamin be released and that he be enslaved in his stead. Because of the silver cup found in Benjamin's sack, the vizier broke down into tears. He could not control himself any longer and so he sent the Egyptian men out of the house. Then he revealed to the Hebrews that he was in fact their brother, Joseph. He wept so loudly that even the Egyptian household heard it outside. The brothers were frozen and could not utter a word. He brought them closer and relayed to them the events that had happened and told them not to fear, that what they had meant for evil God had meant for good. Then he commanded them to go and bring their father and his entire household into Egypt to live in the province of Goshen, because there were 5 more years of famine left. So Joseph supplied them Egyptian transport wagons, new garments, silver money, and 20 additional donkeys carrying provisions for the journey. Thus, Israel and his entire house of 70 gathered up with all their livestock and began their journey to Egypt. As they approached Egyptian territory, Judah went ahead to ask Joseph where the caravan should unload. They were directed into the province of Goshen, and Joseph readied his chariot to meet his father there. It had been over 20 years since Joseph had last seen his father. When they met, they embraced each other and wept together for quite a while. His father then remarked, "Now let me die, since I have seen your face, because you are still alive." Afterward, Joseph's family personally met the Pharaoh of Egypt. The Pharaoh honored their stay and even proposed that if there were any qualified men in their house, then they may elect a chief herdsman to oversee Egyptian livestock. Because the Pharaoh had such a high regard for Joseph, practically making him his equal, it had been an honor to meet his father. Thus, Israel was able to bless the Pharaoh. The family was then settled in Goshen. Father's blessing in passing, the house of Israel acquired many possessions and multiplied exceedingly during the course of 17 years, even through the worst of the 7-year famine. At this time, Joseph's father was 147 years old and bedridden. He had fallen ill and lost most of his vision. Joseph was called into his father's house, and Israel pleaded with his son that he not be buried in Egypt. Rather, he requested to be carried to the land of Canaan to be buried with his forefathers. Joseph was sworn to do as his father asked of him. Later, Joseph came to visit his father, having with him and his 2 sons, Ephraim and Manasseh. Then Israel laid his left hand on the eldest Manasseh's head and his right hand on the youngest Ephraim's head, and blessed Joseph. However, Joseph was displeased that his father's right hand was not on the head of his firstborn, so he switched his father's hands. But Israel refused, saying, "But truly his younger brother shall be greater than he," a declaration he made just as Israel himself was to his firstborn brother Esau. To Joseph, he gave a portion more of Canaanite property than he had to his other sons, land that he fought for against the Amorites. Then Israel called all of his sons in and prophesied their blessings or curses to all 12 of them in order of their ages. To Joseph he declared, "Joseph is a fruitful bough by a well. His branches run over the wall. The archers have bitterly grieved him, have shot at him and hated him. But his bow remained in strength, and the arms of his hands were made strong by the hands of the mighty God of Jacob. By the God of your father who will help you, and by the Almighty who will bless you with blessings of heaven above, blessings of the deep that lies beneath, blessings of the breasts and of the womb. The blessings of your father have excelled the blessings of my ancestors, up to the utmost bound of the everlasting hills. They shall be on the head of Joseph, and on the crown of the head of him who was separate from his brothers." Genesis chapter 49 verses 22 to 26 Nkjv. After relaying his prophecies, Israel died. The family, including the Egyptians, mourned him 70 days. Joseph had his father embalmed, a process that took 40 days. Then he prepared a great ceremonial journey to Canaan, leading the servants of the Pharaoh and the elders of the houses Israel and Egypt beyond the Jordan River. They stopped at Atad, where they observed 7 days of mourning. Here, their lamentation was so great that it caught the attention of surrounding Canaanites, who remarked, "This is a deep mourning of the Egyptians," so they named this spot Abel Mizraim. Then Joseph buried Israel in the cave of Machpelah, the property of Abraham, when he bought it from the Hittites. After their father died, the brothers of Joseph feared retribution for being responsible for Joseph's deliverance into Egypt as a slave. Joseph wept as they spoke and told him that what had happened was God's purpose to save lives and the lives of his family. He comforted them and their ties were reconciled. Joseph's burial. Joseph lived to the age of 110, living to see his great-grandchildren. Before he died, he made the children of Israel swear that when they left the land of Egypt they would take his bones with them, and on his death his body was embalmed and placed in a coffin in Egypt. The children of Israel remembered their oath, and when they left Egypt during the Exodus, Moses took Joseph's bones with him. The bones were buried at Shechem, in the parcel of ground which Jacob bought from the sons of Hamor, which has traditionally been identified with site of Joseph's tomb, before Jacob and all his family moved to Egypt. Shechem was in the land which was allocated by Joshua to the tribe of Ephraim, one of the tribes of the house of Joseph. After the conquest of Canaan, dreams as motif and contribution to narrative. The motif of dreams, dream interpretation, contributes to a strong story-like narrative. One can see the structure of a story develop with the distinct episodes containing the dream motif. The exposition contains Joseph's beginnings as a dreamer. This leads him into trouble as, out of jealousy, his brothers sell him into slavery. The next two instances of dream interpretation establish his reputation as a great interpreter of dreams. First, he begins in a low place, interpreting the dreams of prisoners. Then Joseph is summoned to interpret the dreams of Pharaoh himself. Impressed with Joseph's interpretations, Pharaoh appoints him as second in command. This sets up the climax of the story, which many regard to be the moment Joseph reveals his identity to his brothers.